out on the Hook Peninsula in County Wexford in Ireland. There's the imposing structure of Loftus Hall, standing high on the cliff face overlooking the crashing waves below. Despite this foreboding atmosphere, it's a stately looking building once home to a noble family. But as the legend goes, it was allegedly the home that the devil himself used to take shelter from a storm in the 1700s. Since that infamous night, stories of a ghostly woman forever wandering the halls have been frequently reported, as have the reports of other paranormal encounters that have continued for hundreds of years, making Loftus Hall potentially one of the most haunted houses in Ireland. Before we even get on to Loftus Hall itself, we need to talk about the Hook Peninsula, because that whole stretch of coast along South Wexford, it's dangerous waters. It's not known as the graveyard of 1,000 ships for nothing. Notoriously bad weather, and it's the Atlantic Ocean, so very treacherous. But the thing is, it's a convenient little route to go between Ireland, Britain and the continent, so needs must kind of thing. In 1170, the Anglo-Normans decided they wanted a slice of Ireland for themselves. And when I say slice, I mean this Anglo-Norman invasion of Ireland was kind of the kick-off point of centuries of Irish colonisation by the British. These Normans had come over from England after beating the English in 1066 and were looking for their next conquest. In May of 1170, they'd landed in County Wexford and had slaughtered 3,000 local men. That's a lot of blood staining the land about 3 miles away from where Loftus Hall is now. But back then there wasn't a building until one of those invading Normans, a guy called Raymond le Gros, also known as Raymond Fitzgerald, decided it would make a nice spot for a castle. Whether he was awarded the lands for his courageous part in beating back the savage native Irishmen, and if you can't tell, that is sarcasm, or whether he'd just taken them for himself because he and his men killed anyone that was going to tell them no, we just don't really know. But this first castle was called Houseland Castle and would be where Raymond would live the rest of his days and eventually die. By 1350, the family name had kind of morphed from Raymond into Redmond, so now they were known as the Redmond family. And they rebuilt their family home on the site of the old castle and called it Redmond Hall. Again, another few hundred years passed and generations of the Redmond family continued to call the hall their home. But by 1649, Oliver Cromwell was on the scene. And you might remember Oliver Cromwell from historical exploits such as the English Civil War, Charlie loses his head, or the Puritan who stole Christmas. And the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland was particularly brutal. Lots of death, lots of suffering, eventually culminating in the English taking land off the Irish Catholics and giving it to English Protestants. By that time there was a guy called Alexander Redmond living in Redmond Hall, and even at 68 years old he was there defending his family home. He succeeded in beating back Cromwell's men and carried on living in the house, eventually died, and then passed it on to his son Nicholas Redmond. New waves of soldiers came to try and force the Redmonds out. This has been your family home for centuries at this point. You're going to be doing all you can to try and keep it in the family. But eventually, after successfully defending his home against these soldiers, Nicholas actually surrendered. And surrender meant automatic forfeiture of your estate. Because he surrendered though, they went easy on him and he was able to continue living in Redmond Hall until his death in the early 1650s, but after that, it's eviction time. The Redmond family were out and the estate was given to Sir Nicholas Loftus, an English planter, which basically means that where the Irish land has been confiscated and given to the colonisers that have come over from England. And it was Nicholas's son Henry who was the first Loftus to move into the hall in 1666. Obviously, you may want to start distancing yourself from the history of the hall, you've basically just been given someone else's ancestral home just because you were born in the right country at the right time and you practiced the right religion. And so at this point, the hall was renamed to Loftus Hall. And the Loftuses basically pick up where the Redmonds left off, it becomes their family home and generations of the Loftus family grow up, live and die there. And it's during this point in history where the most infamous story attached to the home occurs. As I'm going to set the scene for you. It's about Christmas time, 1765. A guy called Charles Tottenham is living there. He's man of the house after marrying into the Loftus family via his first wife, Anne. And they'd had a daughter, again called Anne. But by 1765, Charles was on his second wife. I believe her name was Jane. And so it was Charles, his daughter Anne, and her stepmother Jane living in Loftus Hall at the time. And it was still a fine house. It's big and quite clearly a noble family would live there with their staff and whatnot. But it's looking a little worse for wear. It's not exactly the height of luxury at the time. And so this one night, there's a storm blowing outside. Waves are crashing, rain's coming in sideways. All of a sudden, there's this loud knock on the door. One of the servants goes to answer the door and informs Charles Tottenham that there's a stranger outside who is looking to shelter from the storm. Apparently, this guy had been the only passenger aboard a ship that had docked in the bay like just down the road from Loftus Hall to try and wait out the storm. He'd got a horse from somewhere, whether he'd like got it from a farmer near the bay or something, and he'd headed straight up for the only house for miles around that had any light coming from it, Loftus Hall. And this guy, apart from being drenched, he's well-dressed, polite, well-spoken, and so Charles Tottenham invites him to stay for a few days, like, wait for the storm to pass. Anne Tottenham, the daughter, is instantly obsessed with this guy. It's the most excitement she's had in her life, this tall, dark and handsome stranger knocking on the door in the middle of the night. And he's charming. What's not to love? Apparently her father, Charles, he's quite a cold, unfeeling man, so not a super supportive father figure, which I guess wouldn't have been an unusual family dynamic of the time. But then Jane was also not particularly friendly or pleasant. So just think of any fairy tale trope about the evil stepmother, and apparently that's what she was like. So it wasn't a great atmosphere for Anne to live in, quite a lonely existence, and this may have been part of the reason why the stranger was the best thing since sliced bread, One night after the stranger had fully ingratiated himself with the family, they're all totally comfortable with this guy at this point, they're playing cards. Lady Anne apparently dropped one of her cards, and when she bent down to pick it up, she happened to look over to where the stranger was sitting and saw 2 cloven hooves, where the man's feet should have been. Naturally, she screamed. Everyone's a bit like, what's going on? This stranger, realising he's been rumbled, he shot through the ceiling of the room, up through the 3 floors of the house and out the roof in a fireball, leaving behind nothing but a burning hole in the roof and the smell of sulphur. According to the legend, that hole could never be repaired until the house was fully restored a bit later on in the 1870s. But after that night, Anne Tottenham was inconsolable. And here's where the story starts to get real murky. Apparently, she retired to the tapestry room, which was her favourite room in the house, and would refuse to leave it, instead choosing to sit by the window, watching the ocean, waiting for this stranger to return. Whether it was her choice or not to stay in the tapestry room, that's the bit that's unclear. Because there are some versions of the story that say that because Anne was in this totally catatonic state, clearly suffering with some mental health issues after this experience, Charles actually locked her in the tapestry room, just to keep her hidden away. Because they were still a noble, well-to-do family, mental illness was not something they wanted associated with the family name. Crazy is not the Tottenham Loftus brand. So while Anne was locked in the tapestry room, there were apparently weird things starting to happen. It's said that there was some manner of poltergeist activity apparently going on at this time, but it doesn't specifically say what. I'm gonna guess noises, random things moving around and all of that. But as well as that, there was apparently something so evil and otherworldly going on in the house after this that they had trouble keeping staff. One report said at night that you could hear the hooves of a horse galloping around the hall, as if the devil has come back on his horse and is trying to get back in. The family were apparently at their wits' end with what was going on. There was just so much activity. And so the Tottenham family did the unthinkable. They called in a Catholic priest. See, this is still during the time of the penal laws in Ireland, where it was illegal to practice as a Catholic priest. So this devoutly Protestant family calling in help from the Catholic Church, that's a big deal. And kind of gives a bit of an indication about how this family was feeling at the time as well. And at least this part of the story is actually documented. There was a letter written by the bishop to a Reverend Thomas Broaders, instructing him to go to Loftus Hall and perform an exorcism on this house. It took several days for Thomas Broaders to do the best he could. The activity was obviously ramping up around him. He was trying to perform this exorcism, but eventually he managed to drive out the evil forces in most of the house, everywhere but the tapestry room. Was it something to do with the fact that Anne Tottenham was still in that room? Because she was still alive. Was it that the door was locked so he just couldn't get in there? That's something that's kind of glossed over in all the versions of the story that I've found. But either way, as far as he was concerned, that was as good as it was going to get. Job well done, and he headed off. And it's even now written on his gravestone after he died in 1773 that he did, quote, good for all and banished the devil from Loftus Hall. Apparently the activity did subside after the exorcism, and Anne continued to either confine herself or be confined to the tapestry room until she eventually died in 1775. The story goes on to say that when she died, she had been sat with her knees tucked into her chest under her chin, and that she'd been sat like that for so long that her legs could not be straightened out afterwards. And so obviously after she died, she was interred at the Tottenham family mausoleum. In the 1940s, this mausoleum was vandalised and the door was broken down. I mean, like, really, who does that? But anyway, apparently, when workmen were called in to seal up the door, they found an unusually shaped coffin. And so the way that they described this coffin, it had like an upward slant to it. Like, it wasn't just one of those flat oblong boxes that we all end up in one day. Which makes the whole detail about her not being able to lie flat a little bit more compelling, doesn't it? Or maybe it was because she was locked in that room, no one found her, and rigor mortis? Aside from the fact that there's no record of this discovery in the 1940s, no names of workmen or anything, so grain of salt. I am going to pick apart this entire story eventually anyway, but just right now I'm just telling you as I've read it. But as stories go, it's a pretty wild one, isn't it? The devil himself shooting up through the ceiling in a fireball and Anne being hysterical afterwards until her death. Almost unbelievable how crazy that story is. There is an ulterior explanation for this legend. And it goes that there was a stranger that came to stay with the Tottenhams, and that their daughter Anne had taken a shine to him, but that he'd also fancied a bit of Anne too, and that at some point they'd gotten together in a manner that was not appropriate for an unmarried daughter of a noble family, and that she'd got pregnant, and that was the reason that she'd been locked up, to basically hide her shame for 9 months. When Charles found out what his daughter and the stranger had done, obviously he kicked the guy out, and then potentially made up this story about the devil to kind of direct attention away from the real reason, maybe? There is another part to this explanation too. Apparently, there was a skeleton found hidden within the walls of the tapestry room near the fireplace, which may have been that of an infant. There's no hard evidence other than that claim came from one of the family members who was there when they were doing the renovations to the house in the 1870s, and they claim that that's what they found. But it makes you think, doesn't it? If there was a skeleton in the wall and it was a baby, did they die naturally? Was it taken care of out of fear of appearances? Or was it because it could have been the spawn of Satan? We don't know. But in both sort of versions of this story, it seems like Loftus Hall started experiencing paranormal activity after this encounter with the stranger. Even fast forward a couple hundred years, people are still talking about it. So by the 1870s, the Loftus family, they're still living in the hall, and now the Most Honourable John Henry Wellington Graham Loftus, the 4th Marquess of Ely, he's man of the house. And it's during this time, between about 1872 and 1884, where he does major renovations to Loftus Hall, including filling that hole in the room that the devil shot out of, allegedly. So it depends what sources you read. Some people say that Loftus Hall was completely demolished and built back up on the same foundations. Others say that it was just major renovations. But either way, these renovations in the 1800s resulted in the hall that still stands today. And yeah, he wants to modernise Loftus Hall, bring it up to spec for the grandeur of the time. He's commissioned this super grand staircase that took something like over a decade to make. And apparently there are only 2 others like it in the world, one in the Vatican and one at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean on the wreckage of the Titanic. Although I couldn't really find like anything about that. And then also Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, her staircase is very similar, thought to be modelled on it, so I don't know. But either way, very fancy staircase. As far as staircases go, that's very fancy. But the reason he's gone to so much effort, he wants to marry into royalty. You see, his mom, Lady Jane Hope Vere Loftus, was a lady-in-waiting for Queen Victoria, so he kind of got like an in with the royals. And Jonathan, he's got his eye on one of Queen Victoria's daughters, Princess Beatrice. He'd done all of this major and expensive renovation work to the family home in the hopes that he could impress Queen Victoria enough on an upcoming visit to give her blessing to marry Princess Beatrice. But it wouldn't quite work out. Queen Victoria got wind of the devil's visit that had apparently happened in Loftus Hall in the 1700s. She didn't really believe in all of that nonsense, but she knew that her husband, Prince Albert, loved a good ghost story. And she didn't want him being all distracted from the main reason of the visit to like experience the history of the place. So she cancelled the trip. John would actually die not too long afterwards anyway, without an heir. Obviously he'd never got to marry into the royal family and produce one. And so the hall passed to his cousin, who put it up for sale. Because those renovations had been so expensive and there was quite a lot of debt still left over. And so in 1917 it passed out of the Loftus family and it was brought by an order of Benedictine nuns who used it as a convent. It looks like they didn't stay for a super long time. A lot of sources were saying that they left quite quickly. Some people were speculating that it just must have not been fit for purpose, whereas others were obviously going along the route of, it must be haunted and that's why they didn't stay. But after that, the Rasminian sisters, who were another order of nuns, they moved into Loftus Hall and started up a school for girls who were interested in joining the order. Look, he's come back. During this time, when there were nuns living in the house, there seems to be some reports of nuns dying on the property. But this information comes from Ghost Adventures, so grain of salt. Although they were interviewing Adrian Quigley, who owned the house at the time, so maybe? I don't know. Apparently there was a nun that died mysteriously on the back staircase, and after that the nuns put what looks like an outline of a cross on the floor. Then there was also a report of 2 nuns that drowned in the bay behind the house. And that now all of these nuns are buried on the grounds of Loftus Hall. But again, only Ghost Adventures claim that, so pinch of salt. After the nuns, a couple called Michael and Kay Devereaux bought the hall in 1983 and reopened it as Loftus Hall Hotel. They had big plans for it to be this huge luxury boutique hotel, and I mean, they did manage it for 10 years. Unfortunately, Michael passed away, apparently in the hall itself, and by the 1990s, the building was abandoned and in a bit of a sorry state. It was falling down, there was holes in the roof where rain was getting in, it just wasn't great. And it was going to cost millions to fix up, so no one really wanted to touch it. That was until 2011 when the Quigley family took it on and basically poured their heart and soul into saving Loftus Hall. They did major structural work, got the building safe and secure again, and actually started offering guided tours of the place. Kind of operating it as a visitor attraction, like let paranormal investigators in, like all of that. They then sold it in 2021 to this hotel developer. And it's still closed at the minute as of 2024, but there's rumblings of what's going on with it. It looks like they've redone the outside and sort of like given it a breath of fresh air, and they've also changed the name. Is it in an attempt to separate from the history and potentially paranormal? Maybe, or is it just their brand? But it is now apparently going to be called Ladyville House. And when it eventually opens, it's going to be a 22-bedroom luxury 5-star hotel. Which, I mean, fair enough. Like, it's a good way for old houses like this to make an income so that they can survive for another 100 years. It just means that there's probably not going to be any opportunity for any further paranormal investigation. Big boutique 5-star hotels don't tend to want to bring attention to ghosts. But maybe you don't need all the gadgets and gizmos. Maybe the guests just staying in the hotel will experience weird things going on. Because while the exorcism did help to seemingly dampen down the more negative experiences, the activity never fully went away. Obviously, Anne Tottenham herself passed away in 1775. I'm gonna go out on a limb and guess she died in the tapestry room. And especially after that, there are lots of reports centering around the ghost of a young woman wearing a silk dress, similar to what would have been the fashion of the time in the late 1700s. She's seen wandering around the entire house, but obviously she's more commonly seen in the tapestry room. So these stories I'm about to tell you happened in the decades after Anne's death, people staying in the house as guests of the Loftus family and staff experiences and whatnot. So it's still fairly fresh after the event, like late 1700s, early 1800s kind of time. The first account was in 1790 when a guy was visiting the house and was put up in the tapestry room. He woke up in the middle of the night feeling this sudden weight on the bed as if something unseen had sat on the bed with him. All of a sudden, he hears this horrible growl and the covers are ripped off the bed and the curtains around the bed, obviously like this is a 4-poster bed, they're flung around. Immediately, like he gets out of bed thinking it must be just some of his mates having a laugh. So he starts shouting at them to basically like knock it off. Looks all around the room, checks the door, it's still locked, and there is no one in there with him. A few years later, that same guy's son, a Reverend George Reed, he stayed in Loftus Hall. His father had refused to talk about whatever it was that he had experienced that night up to that point. So George had no idea why he should have been terrified about being given the tapestry room to stay in for a couple of nights. So he was sat in bed reading on the first night and he noticed the door open. Standing in the doorway was the ghostly figure of a young woman. She proceeded to float through the room before disappearing near a wardrobe. And despite how very not usual this was, he doesn't really seem to have thought much of it. Like, he just went to sleep, no problem that night. The second night, again, the woman was floating through the tapestry room. This time he was a bit more prepared and he kind of lunged forward to grab her in a kind of got you now, what are you doing in my room sort of thing. But where he should have made contact with this woman, he just went straight through thin air. Over the years, so many people staying in that room reported the same thing. The figure will open the door and glide towards the wardrobe. Some people will also hear the growling, and others will even have all their stuff thrown all around the room. Like, it's becoming abundantly clear at this point that people staying in the tapestry room aren't going to have a great night's sleep. During the 4th Marquess of Ely's renovations in 1872, that tapestry room was actually turned into a billiards room, which, I don't know, seems like the spirit of Anne didn't really take too kindly to. Because after those renovations, the staff would report hearing horrid noises coming from that room at night, of all the billiard balls being like bashed about, as though those were the older stories that came about after Anne Tottenham had died. And it seems like almost as soon as she had passed away, Loftus Hall suddenly had a ghost problem. And it still remains, allegedly, incredibly haunted. I mean, it's often talked about as one of the most haunted houses in Ireland, and seemingly with good reason. Pretty much as soon as Loftus Hall was opened up to the public by the Quigleys in 2012, there have been reports of weird things happening. And funnily enough, a lot does seem to be centred around the tapestry room. Everything from cold spots, disembodied footsteps, and even doors opening and curtains moving on their own when there aren't any drafts from the window. Which I know, a lot could be explained away by it being just like this very old house where there may be rogue drafts somewhere else in the house, creaks and bangs and all of that. What's a little harder to explain away is the physical contact. One guest once claimed she was in the tapestry room on one of these tours and she freaked out because she felt someone grab her ankle. Like unmistakable, hands wrapping around your ankle kind of feeling. One 5-year-old kid was once on this tour. Again, they'd gone into the tapestry room and he asked his parents, "Why is the man standing in the corner staring at us?" Why do little kids say the creepiest things? But was it that this kid was picking up on a different entity that wasn't Anne Tottenham and was potentially responsible for the more negative interactions in that room? Like the growls and all of that sort of stuff. And there was one story that came out of the interview with Adrian Quigley on Ghost Adventures. There was a tour going on, and it must have been in the evening or something as it was dark, and the electricity went out. Brilliant, this group has just got to the tapestry room and all the lights go out. I would 100% think that was just part of the tour though. They'd got infrared cameras, so back at the sort of like security station, staff members could see clearly what happened next. Which was that while this group and the tour guide were waiting for the lights to come back on, one guy on the tour just launched himself at this woman, another visitor on the tour, grabs her by the neck. Just absolutely terrifying. This is pitch black and some guy comes up to you and grabs you by the throat. He had to be literally rugby tackled to the ground by staff members, and he was just like so angry for whatever reason. Possibly affected by something that's a little bit more negative in that room, the very room that Father Thomas Broaders wasn't able to exorcise. Or just some loser who decided that it would be a good idea to attack a woman for apparently no reason. Like, I don't know any more than that. I don't know if the guy knew the woman or if it was just that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't know. Elsewhere in the hall though, other things have been reported. Apparently the figure of a nun has been spotted, like a full-bodied apparition. She'll be there standing in front of you one second and then gone the next, like blink and she's gone kind of thing. There have also been the sounds of what seems like organ music captured on digital recorders, which wouldn't have been a sound that would be out of place most likely when the nuns were living there. But then there's the Sacred Heart of Jesus statues. Apparently, whenever they're left anywhere in the hall, they'll all inexplicably encounter an accident, which results in them losing their heads. No idea why. Coincidence? Maybe. And then there's Anne Tottenham herself. Some people have reported hearing the sounds of Anne crying to be let out of the tapestry room. Which I would have loved to find out who exactly was claiming that, but all I could find was quote-unquote people, which isn't super helpful. She's also apparently been witnessed doing her what seems like fairly regular stroll in the tapestry room. And apparently in 2014, a guy called Thomas Beavis took a photo of the hall that looks like it potentially captured the image of what looks like a young woman, maybe? And then others, again, have even claimed to hear the sounds of horses' hooves galloping around the outside of the hall as if the devil himself has broken the blessings of Father Thomas Broaders and has come back. More often than anything though, so many people report the intense feeling of being watched and seeing shadow figures flitting about in the corner of their eyes. And then some people just get an overwhelming feeling of unease and discomfort when they enter certain areas of the hall. Like they just need to get out of that specific area for no reason at all. And so with the story involving the devil himself and the regularity of reports coming out of the place, after doing all the research I can absolutely see why Loftus Hall is known as one of the most haunted houses in Ireland. But let me know your thoughts. Is Loftus Hall as haunted as it's claimed to be? Have you visited and experienced anything that was a bit off? I'd love to know. First of all, we've got the first haunted house tick. It's centuries old, has seen lots of people living and dying within the walls. So I can absolutely see from that side how this place could have picked up a ghost or two over the years. When it comes to the legend, I mean, it's called a legend, and from that alone we know it's probably almost certainly embellished. But like most legends, there are grains of truth buried in there. We know the names of the people involved. Well, apart from the mysterious stranger. But then, was that Charles was telling someone about what had happened? Like potentially what happened with his daughter Anne? And the person asked, "Oh, so what's this stranger's name?" And Charles just screams back, "He's the devil!" Meaning that he was just a man with ill intentions towards his fair daughter, and the story snowballed from there. Just a thought to ruminate on. But yeah, the facts are that we know the Tottenhams were living there at the time, we know that the church instructed Thomas Broaders to exorcise the house, and we know that Anne died in 1775. The rest is just kind of depends who you asked as to what answer you get. My thoughts? I think there was a stranger. I think he started a forbidden love affair with Anne, and I think Charles found out and told the man to get the hell out of his house. Whether Anne fell pregnant and had the child that was walled up in the tapestry room, it's possible, and it would explain why she was locked away, because I do think she was locked away, and also why her mental health was so bad afterwards. When it comes to being haunted though, I think take the legend out of it completely and just go on that theory alone that it was just this love affair, maybe she had this kid, maybe she didn't, but she was so tormented and locked in this room. That alone is going to be big emotions that could potentially lead to a residual haunting. But those are just my thoughts. Let me know what you think and what version of the legend you feel is closer to the truth. Once the hotel is built, it will be interesting to see if any of the workmen or anything experienced anything weird, or if hotel staff start experiencing strange things. That's going to be interesting to see in the next few years. If you enjoyed this video though, I would love it if you'd let me know by just leaving me a small like, just a little one. And if you want more of this, please subscribe. It would be lovely to have you around. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious, and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. It's not known as the graveyard of 1,000 ships for nothing. And now it's rush hour.